All right, so for today, we're going to be looking at the origins of the Cold War, which takes place officially after World War II. Most people kind of put like the official date, I would say like 1949 is when we kind of look at the Cold War, really up until the early 1990s. But if you think of like the Cold War, like immediately after World War II, honestly, you're pretty much going to be good to go. The Cold War is going to be between the United States and the Soviet Union or Russia. Even though they're technically called the Soviet Union at this time, the Soviet Union won't go back to the name of Russia until, the early 90s. The Soviet Union and Russia, they do become, I would say, like interchangeable in terms of like the country names and things like that. Part of the reason that this, Cold War is going to emerge is because the United States and the Soviet Union are going to emerge in sort of this like battle of like the brothers almost. Like they want to prove that like one is better than the other. And for those of you who did your atomic bomb essay and had read about the fact that the United States was, trying to impress the Soviet Union with the fact that they had an atomic bomb, that's going to be kind of like where this rivalry is going to start between the two countries. So what exactly does a Cold War mean? A Cold War means no direct military campaign, aka the United States and Uncle Sam and the Soviet Union and these grizzly bears never actually come into contact with one another physically. Now, what exactly does that mean? It's a psychological warfare, right? They're basically trying to psych one another out. Like, hey, the United States got an atomic bomb? Well, we, the Soviet Union, also need to get an atomic bomb now. Oh, wait a second. The Soviet Union has an atomic bomb? Well, then we, the United States, have to make a hydrogen bomb. And they're really just trying to compete out-compete one another. So when one country does something, the other country's like, we have to outdo you. Now, when I say no direct military campaign, what I mean is that the United States and the Soviet Union never necessarily fight directly against one another. However, I will say that there are like some fightings between like the two ideals, this capitalism versus communism. We especially see that in Vietnam, which really takes place from the 50s, 60s, and even early 70s. And we see it in the Korean War as well. But the United States and the Soviet Union never actually have direct military contact with one another. Again, they're just trying to psych one another out, like, I'm better than you, and I'm going to show you how. So why exactly did the United States and the Soviet Union become enemies? Well, there's going to be a couple of reasons for that. The United States is going to terminate the Lend-Lease aid on the Soviet Union. So if you remember, like even before World War II began, the United States had that Lend-Lease policy. We're like, hey, if you like come on over to the United States, we'll like happily like lend you weapons and we'll lend you different supplies that you might need for the war. Like just come on over and we'll help you out. And even though like the US was claiming to be neutral, again, we know the US wasn't exactly neutral. They definitely had a side. They were definitely with the Allies. Even before World War II, the Soviet Union had sided with Hitler and the Axis powers. If you remember in August of 1939, the Soviet Union and Germany had signed that Nazi-Soviet non-aggression pact saying, hey, we're not going to go to war with one another, and we're secretly going to split up Poland and other territories. It wasn't until 1941, when Hitler broke the pact, that the Soviet Union was like, all right, screw you Axis powers, we're going to head on over to the Allied forces. So the fact that the U.S. had sort of like treated like the Soviet Union as like the gum at the bottom of the shoe, right, kind of like worthless compared to everyone else, didn't sit too hot with the Soviet Union. Some of the reasons that they're going to become enemies was the Soviet Union was upset that the U.S. had kept the atomic bomb a secret. If any of you watch that Hiroshima documentary, it'll mention in there that, like, at the Potsdam Conference, like, Truman had mentioned to, like, Joseph Stalin, the Soviet Union, like, yeah, we have this new weapon, it's really, really big and strong, and it's, like, bigger than any bomb that, like, we've ever had, like, it's pretty cool, but he's not exactly, like, very forthcoming with the fact, like, yeah, it's not just a bomb, like, it's an atomic bomb, like, this defies physics, science, anything that you could possibly think of. So when the United States officially launched the atomic bomb over Hiroshima on August 6th of 1945, and then 3 days later launched another atomic bomb, on Nagasaki, the Soviet Union was not happy. At that point, they had agreed to invade Japan along with the United States, which the Soviet Union is going to do after the Nagasaki bombing, but they're kind of like, wait a second, I thought we were friends with the United States. You don't keep secrets from your friends, you tell each other what's going on. Why wouldn't they have told us that they had an atomic bomb? Yeah, they mentioned they had a bomb, but they knew it wasn't any type of regular bomb. This was an atomic bomb. And so when the Soviet Union saw like those, atomic bombings in August of 45, they were upset that they essentially had kept out of the loop. So for the Soviet Union, they're like, how can we trust you when you clearly can't tell us what's going on and what you have on your side? And of course, the US was angry that Stalin had allied with Hitler for a time. The United States isn't stupid, right? Stalin didn't, come over to the Allied powers because, he was like, oh, this is the side I want to be on. He came to that side out of convenience. When Hitler decided to break that Nazi-Soviet non-aggression pact in 1941, Stalin's like, okay, well, I'm no longer on Hitler's side, so therefore I've got to join the other team. So the US knows like the Soviet Union is really just there for convenience. They're not there because like they truly believe in like democratic principles or fighting for democracy around the world. That's not why they're there. They're there out of convenience because they got screwed over by their other ally. So really from the get-go, the United States and the Soviet Union don't really have a lot of trust with one another. And really, like, the biggest difference between the two countries is going to be communism and capitalism. Do you need to write all this down? I would say no. If you're someone who understands, like, the basics between communism and capitalism, you might want to write down a couple of different bullet points here. But if you get, like, the whole concept, then no need to write everything down. Here's what's interesting about communism. Communism is great in theory. In theory, I would say it's probably the best government. In practice, it's the absolute worst government because the idea in communism is that everybody is equal and gets treated equally and has the same stuff. However, think about it like a group project. If you've ever been in a group project with, say, 4 or 5 people, you always know there's 1 or 2 people who do not pull their weight. And they're going to get the same grade as everybody else. And for the people that worked hard on that group project, they're really pissed off. John and Kayla didn't do anything, so why should they get credit, when Samantha, Stephanie, and Austin did all the work, right? It's not fair. And I'm sure some of you have gone to teachers before and explained it, and there are some teachers that are probably like, oh, well, this is what happens, and blah, blah, blah. That's essentially what happens in a communistic society. Everybody's treated equally, and people can't profit off of one another's. So as a result, whether you're sort of like a doctor or a janitor or a car salesman and a teacher, you all get treated and essentially paid the exact same, even though we know that that's probably not fair. In communism, there's a lower average standard of living, but again, in theory, the idea is everyone is equal. So, like, obviously here in the United States, everyone's got different cars. So I have, like, a Ford Focus. Somebody with more money might have, like, a Tesla or a Mercedes or a BMW or whatever it may be. And, like, a communistic society, you don't exactly get choices, right? You kind of get what's handed to you. So even, like, with something like a car, everyone might have a Fiat. Which, if you've seen Fiats, they're very tiny cars. Now, it's a car, it works, it'll get you from point A to B, but again, you don't necessarily have a lot of choice. If I all of a sudden tomorrow won the lottery, I might be like, you know what, I want to buy a Range Rover, and that should be my right to do so. In a communist country, though, that privilege and that right's never exactly going to happen, so you're going to be stuck with your little Fiat as a car for pretty much all of eternity. In communism, it is a controlled economy, so the government kind of decides what goes in, what goes out, who makes what, so you don't necessarily sort of get to earn your living. You also don't necessarily always get to choose your career. Sometimes those things are assigned to you, and I would say in a lot of European countries, a tracking system exists. So by the time you get to the 8th grade, they have you take a test, and if they're like, hey, little Johnny's not very scholastic, we're going to put him on track to maybe work in a warehouse or something, that's sort of what gets done in a communistic country. In the United States, we know that that isn't the case, right? You go to high school until the 12th grade, and then after that, you get to choose what type of career that you want to do. Even if we know little Johnny's never going to cure cancer, right? If little Johnny wants to go and be a plumber, he should have the ability to do so. And in a controlled economy, though, that's not always the case. You're kind of given what you need to do based on what you're good at, and not necessarily what it is that you want to do. In a communist country, there's only one party of government, so there's no need for more. So it would be the Communist Party. That can definitely be a problem because, again, no different ideas aren't shared, ideas aren't challenged, so therefore nothing really changes. I would say nothing gets done. Things are going to get done, but there isn't a lot of change. You don't have people sort of challenging the status quo, which is what you want people to do, right? That's why we all vote in the first place, is we want things to change for the better. But because there's only one political party in a communist country, you're going to have a really hard time instilling change in the future. Now, a capitalist society is completely different. In a capitalist society, any person should be free to start a business and employ people if they want to. So right now, I'm a teacher. If tomorrow I decided, you know what, I hate teaching, I no longer want to do this, I could absolutely quit my job and go start a department store if I wanted to. I have the right to do that. I might be super successful or I might completely fail. Again, that is my right in a capitalist society. In a communist society, that's not exactly going to be the case. So in capitalism, again, if I want to be a teacher or a business owner, I want to be a cop, or, I want to work at the grocery store, I have the right to do that. At the end of the day, I have the ability to choose. In a capitalist society, you earn and work for a wage. So obviously, I'm a teacher. I don't make as much money as a doctor, right? That is never going to happen. However, I've chosen my career, I've chosen my field, and so therefore I get the pay with which goes with my career. And again, if I don't like it, I can quit tomorrow and go find a completely different job. That is absolutely my right. And then we also know that people get paid differently. So, like, the amount that I get paid as a teacher here in California is going to be very different than what teachers, say, in Ohio get paid. Just like if I were to work at In-N-Out, I would be paid very differently there than I would be at, say, McDonald's, right? Those differences come based on where it is you choose to work or where you get a job in general. In capitalism, there is a gap between the rich and the poor because there is a higher standard of living. So kind of going back to the car example, I as a teacher drive a Ford Focus. If somebody, again, was like a doctor, they might drive like a Tesla, a much more expensive car because they can afford to do so. Then you might have some people who live on minimum wage, who don't have a car at all and might have to rely on, public transportation or a bicycle or something like that in order to get around. All very different levels in terms of where we exist, like on the wage scale. And then, of course, in capitalism, there's a choice of many people for government. And, of course, it is chosen by the people. We get an opportunity to vote. We often look at America as a two-party system with the Democrats and Republicans. However, there are plenty of third parties as well. You have independents, you have libertarians, you have the Green Party. But at the end of the day, we have choice. And if in 2 years when elections are up, I don't like my choice, guess what? I get to change that. Or people can create that change now. We're seeing that especially in California with Gavin Newsom, our governor, facing recall. And that's very much could happen. That happened back in 2003 to Gray Davis. That's how Arnold Schwarzenegger, the Terminator, ended up becoming the governor of California. So Californians aren't happy with what's going on. So they're like, you know what? We want to make a change. And so they're making efforts to recall Gavin Newsom. That is an example of where government by the people, for the people, reflects. So in July of 1945 at the Potsdam Conference, basically you have all the major power players there, the United States, the French, the British, as well as the Soviet Union, kind of deciding what it is that they're going to do to kind of hammer out the end of World War II. By July of 1945, the war is still going on between the United States and the Japanese. However, we know that that's going to come to an end pretty quickly. Even Truman knows that's going to come to an end pretty quickly. By the time Truman gets to the Potsdam Conference, he's well aware of the fact that the United States at this point has an atomic bomb, and he's contemplating whether or not to actually use it on the Japanese. At the Yalta Conference in January of 1945, at the time Truman wasn't president, but FDR was. And again, at that Yalta Conference in January of 1945, they knew that the Germans were going to lose. It was only a matter of time. And by May of 1945, Germany's going to officially surrender. So coming into the Potsdam Conference, Truman is coming in as a new president. For the last 12 years, everyone's dealt with FDR. Now they've got to deal with Truman. And so when Truman comes in, he's kind of like, all right, these promises and these deals may have been made at that Yalta Conference 6 months earlier, but FDR is no longer around. I'm around and I'm not a president, and this is how I want to do things. So Truman wants a productive German industry. So he's kind of like, listen, this is an opportunity to rebuild Germany. It's an opportunity for us to kind of, get Germany working again. They become a functional society. We don't want them to fall into a deep depression like they did in the 1920s. That's how we got into this whole World War II mess in the first place. The British, the French, and I would say the Americans were all on board with that. Stalin and the Soviet Union, not so much. They're like, we want reparations, right? We've had 20 million Soviets that were killed as a result of World War II. 20 million soldiers. That's a lot of people. Think about that. That's over half of the people that live in California alone today. So Stalin's like, no, I want money. But the last time we went down this road of reparations, again, it led to Hitler and World War II. So the British, the French, and the Americans are very hesitant to go that reparations route. So one of the things that they decide to do is divide Germany into 4 occupational zones. One controlled by the Soviet Union, one controlled by the British, one controlled by the French, and then one controlled by the United States. And you can see there all the different occupational zones that exist. Berlin, which is the capital of Germany, falls into the Soviet Union's occupational zone. And Munich, which is probably the richest city in all of Germany, that the Bavarian state, it just happens to be a very rich state in general, especially in Germany, falls in the hands of the United States. And in 1846, George Kennan, who is a diplomat for the United States, it means that he represents like the U.S. on an official level. He's kind of figuring out that the United States and the Soviet Union are going to have continued problems, especially as this, big battle is going to come between capitalism and communism. Capitalism being the United States of America, communism being the Soviet Union. And so George Kennan comes up with this plan, and he goes, listen, if the U.S. can stop the Soviets from expanding, eventually they're going to fall apart and there's not going to be any more war. And this policy is going to become known as containment. This is why you get things like the Korean War that happened and the Vietnam War that happened, because all of a sudden communism starts spreading outside of the Soviet Union. And the U.S. is like, okay, if we want communism to stop spreading in countries like Korea and in countries like Vietnam, we're going to have to get involved to stop these things from happening. If we can contain them within their own countries so they don't spread out, almost kind of like a virus, then more than likely communism will die on its own because people are going to see how awful it was. George Kennan very sort of quickly realized that the Soviet Union was a force to be reckoned with. And it wasn't like that, people always say like the U.S. is like number one, the U.S. is great, and all those things are true, but the U.S. has always got people who are competing, right? I would say today, right now, especially China and the United States are definitely very competitive. But during this Cold War, it was the United States and the Soviet Union. And George Kennan realizes the Soviet Union is here to play. They're not going to easily back down. So you're going to have to do something to solve the Soviet problem, to solve that communist problem. And his idea was containment. The U.S. was, of course, going to use some other policies as well. What is everybody's best friend? Think about it. If I wanted to get friends or people to talk to me, the one thing I can do that will get people to talk to me and be friends with me or even hang out with me, even if they don't like me, is money. Money is everybody's best friend. And so after World War II, the United States is going to create the Marshall Plan, in which they're going to give money to countries to basically realize the U.S. is your friend. Capitalism is good. The United States is good. And the Soviet Union is bad. And if you look, the United States is giving a lot of money to countries that are on the west side. United Kingdom, France, West Germany, not East Germany, Italy, the Netherlands, Belgium, even Norway and Sweden. Countries kind of like Yugoslavia, right, aren't necessarily getting a whole lot of money. Why? Because they fall to the east side, which is going to end up coming the communist side. Yesterday in your vocabulary, you should have done the Iron Curtain. Think of the Iron Curtain like this. The West is the best. That's where capitalism is. The East is a beast. That's where communism is. West is the best. East is the beast. West is capitalism. East is communism. If you can remember that, then you can remember the difference between who's pro-US and who is pro-Soviet Union. So again, with the Marshall Plan, the idea is we throw money at these countries, they're going to be friends with the United States and not so much with the Soviet Union. But by 1948, there's going to be a crisis that gets reached in between all these four occupational zones. So in June of 1948, the French, the British, and the American zones were joined into the nation of West Germany after the Soviets refused to end their occupation of Germany. Basically, when you have four different ideologies and three get along and one doesn't, eventually there's going to be conflict, right? There's no way about it. If three people agree on something but one person doesn't, those three people are going to gang up on that one person. That's essentially what happens in these occupational zones. The United States, the British, and the French are kind of like, hey, Soviet Union, we no longer want you here and we want you to leave, and the Soviets, as a result, are going to refuse. There's also another big problem. If you notice, the city of Berlin, which is technically controlled by the British, the French, and the Americans, is in the Soviet region, which means that the United States, the British, and the French are going to have a very hard time getting past the Soviet Union and getting to the capital city, right? It's going to end up being an absolutely huge problem. So the Soviets sort of realized, hey, we've got to do something to solve this problem, to send a message to, sort of these more democratic societies or even sort of Western civilization, right? That's how you can kind of think about it. Again, West is the best, the East is the beast. And so as a result, the Soviets are going to respond with a blockade, and they're going to cut all road and rail traffic to West Berlin, so that way nobody can go in and out. And this is going to last for a very good deal of time, a good 11 months. One of the things that the United States was doing, and I'll talk about in a second as well, is they were dropping over supplies. And one of the things that they were dropping over, especially like into like the east side and the west side, was chocolate. They would drop chocolate from, you know, the planes. And so one of the reasons that they were dropping chocolate, I always ask like kids, like, why do you think they would drop chocolate? Like, who likes chocolate? And they're like, well, kids like chocolate. Like, exactly. They were kind of like sort of doing like a little bit of like propaganda brainwashing. The idea was like if the kids realize, hey, the Americans and the British and French are dropping these chocolate, like they're good people, so therefore the Soviets are the ones that are bad. So the U.S. was definitely trying to employ like some propaganda tactics to get people on the east side to realize, hey, the Soviet Union is not your friend, they are your enemy. And the United States, the British, and the French, we are your friends. And so for 11 months, cargo planes is going to bring food, medicine, as well as coal to West Berlin. The goal is to keep West Berlin alive without starting a war, which is going to be successful. However, this is only going to last for a short amount of time because we know by 1961, the Berlin Wall is officially going to be built. We will get into that sometime after spring break. What this is going to lead to is NATO, which stands for the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And the United States is still a part of NATO today. You have several countries that are a member of like sort of that allied or that alliance force. The idea with NATO is that an attack on one is an attack on all, and that's something that still exists today. Like in 2001, when the United States was attacked in New York at the Twin Towers on September 11th, the United States called on their NATO allies saying, hey, we were attacked and we need your help in sort of fighting back those who attacked us. And the NATO allies definitely came to play. But NATO is a very important alliance. Like I said, it's existed since the late 1940s, and it exists part of like this Cold War Berlin crisis airlift issue. And then, of course, the Korean War is eventually going to take place as well. So Korea is going to split in 1950. North Korea is going to be communist. South Korea is going to become capitalist. If you can remember, like Kim Jong-un, and he's like a total nut job, he comes from the north side of Korea. Korea was really a sort of a test of the containment policy. And Truman is going to send troops, to Korea to sort of help out. And by 1953, a truce is officially going to be reached, and Korea is going to split at the 38th parallel, and this becomes known as the DMZ, or the Demilitarized Zone. Even today, South Korea and North Korea are split at like that DMZ level. Although technically the split is not necessarily official. So even though we recognize Korea as North Korea and South Korea, they've never like formally split. So even when like the Olympics come into play, they compete as Korea. They don't compete as North and South because they never officially split. It's just the way that things have really been done. A couple of years ago was the first time that both North Korea and South Korea party leaders had met for like the first time basically since 1953, and they each crossed over like the little demilitarized zone. You can look it up on YouTube. It's a very kind of like sweet moment, and some of the kids were like joking around. They're like, oh, Kim Jong-un's going to snatch the South Korean president and like bring him back over to North Korea. But it is a very dangerous zone. It's considered the most dangerous zone pretty much in all of the world. If you cross over to North Korea, you ain't coming back. It is very difficult to get over there. It's even more difficult to come back. At the DMZ, there's like a little place where you can like enter a building where like North Korea and South Korea, meet in talks. And at that point, you can sort of quote unquote officially cross into North Korea. But they warn you, if you cross over to North Korea, the South Koreans and the Americans, they cannot rescue you. They cannot help you. And you will probably be tortured and die. But North Korea is a crazy place. There's tons of documentaries on North Korea and just how like insane it is. Tons of propaganda there. Everything's pretty much controlled by the state. I remember years ago I was watching this documentary, and like these North Koreans were sitting around eating dinner, and the electricity goes out, and they're like, oh, damn Americans, this is their fault. The Americans have nothing to do with like the electricity in North Korea going out, but these people are so brainwashed to think that they believe that everybody hates North Korea and that like North Korea has these people's best interests at heart, even though many of them are starving and live pretty awful lives.